Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2. I'm super excited to be here, and I'm so excited to see all of you in the audience because we're going to do some great things together. Yesterday, Lisa Delpit challenged us to think about what schools would be like if we told and believed a different story about our students and what they're capable of. What if our schools, your schools, created spaces for our students to really belong and see their aspirational identities reflected back in the faces of the educators all around them? What if their brains were free from the stress of fighting stereotype threat, free from stress of not fitting in and not feeling like they're good enough, free from putting up the guard to either be protective, as she said, to hide out or act out, so that they can be free to be curious, free to question, free to stretch out their comfort zone, and free to speak out, and free to create. Do you believe this is possible? The great news, the reason I'm so excited today, the reason I love my job, is that I fully believe that the people in this room are the right people to get this done. You are the principals, the assistant principals, the deans, the teacher leaders, the teacher coaches, the whisperers of children and adults, and you have the power and the awesome responsibility to create the conditions for this vision. You decide what will happen, what will not happen. You decide who to exclude and who to include, and you decide if the child's story is positive or negative. You decide. We must be the authors of this new narrative. Lisa Delpit reminds us that we can't get rid of the old stories, but we can add new stories and add it in abundance. As a much different narrative about our very talented, creative, inspired, resilient, creative students. And if we don't tell that different story, a counter-narrative to America's story, who will? Chancellor Ferebee and Lisa Delpit gave us a charge yesterday, and today I am honored to introduce Dr. Pamela Cantor, who will seamlessly pick up where they left off and give us the concrete tools that many of you desire so badly so that we can really do this. Dr. Cantor is a child psychiatrist specializing in trauma and resilience building and is a founder of Turnaround for Children, an organization that connects the dots between science, adversity, school performance, and to catalyze healthy student development and academic achievement. Through her many years of study and learning, she has learned that environments can either support healthy development or derail it. Dr. Cantor has earned a BA from Sarah Lawrence College and a medical degree from Cornell University. Prior to founding Turnaround, she was a clinical instructor at in psychiatry at Cornell and a faculty member of the National Center for Children Exposed to Violence, that's a long title, at Yale Child Study Center. Dr. Cantor has shared her insights at the Aspen Ideas Festival, the ASU GSV Summit, iNicole, South by Southwest, and many more. Her work has been highlighted at The Atlantic, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and NPR. She's currently a visiting scholar at Harvard University and a member of the Council of Distinguished Scientists for the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development. I am also proud to call her our mentor. Please welcome Pam Cantor. Welcome to DC Public Schools.
I can tell that there are many friends and colleagues in the room, so let's get started. There are many reasons why a person would want to go to medical school and become a doctor. Mine were really clear. I went to med school to study trauma, how it affects the body and the mind, so that one day I'd be a doctor that could help children to heal. This was because I knew trauma as a child. I grew up in a neighborhood with many cousins living nearby, so there were always sleepovers. And when I was 6 years old, my uncle came into the room where I was sleeping and sexually abused me. He told me this had to be our special secret. I, to this day, don't actually know how many times it happened. But what I do know is that I was terrified to tell my parents. I was scared that they wouldn't believe me. Then one day, I had this dream in which I saw myself dying, and I became terrified, and I knew that I had to tell them. And when I told them, they said to me, "You can never breathe a word of this to anyone. This will hurt our family." I remember even at 6 years old thinking, why are they mad at me and not him? My mother was so ashamed of this that she really couldn't care for me. And my father seemed to be angry at me all the time. There was no help and no protection for many years, just a deep shame that burrowed its way into every aspect of my childhood until the day they died. Literally, the day they died. Their deaths were separated by a decade, but for both of them, their last words to me were the same. They both said, "I'm sorry." But I did get help when I was 15 years old from this amazing psychiatrist. He was a big man with a booming voice, and he was an incredible storyteller, and he told me that I was a pearl in an oyster, not this ugly, dirty thing that I thought I was. It's true, he could have made me believe anything, but it really boiled down to one thing. I was good when I thought to that day that I was bad. So you can imagine the day that I marched into his office and I said, "I'm going to be a doctor." And he looked at me with this big smile and he said, "Of course you are." And I thought, did he not know that to that point I hadn't taken a single science or math course? I was an art major. But he had these magical powers. And I thought for sure he got them in med school, so I had to go to med school to get them too. And like everything else, he was the reason I wanted to go, and he was the person who made me believe I could do it. So I got to med school, and it turned out to be this amazing experience where mysteries were unpacked literally every day. And I learned that there were these complex biological mechanisms that explain everything we're able to do. And not just how our hearts and lungs work, but how we love, how we attach, how we nurture, and most of all, how we heal when things go wrong. So that first year was everything I could have expected about how things work. Anatomy, biology, biochemistry, physiology, all the rules and laws that govern how the body works when it's healthy. But really quickly, two big things became obvious to me, and they were awesome in their power. The first was that doctors don't study illness just to learn about illness. They study illness to learn about health. They want to see the variations and the patterns that happen to people, so when they see them again, they're going to know how to get somebody healthy. Now, this was a completely different way of looking at things, but it reminded me about the way my doctor looked at me because he wanted to know exactly what had happened in my life so that he could help me get healthy again. So the first big thing was studying illness to learn about health. But the second big thing was learning that the most powerful set of forces causing those biologic mechanisms to go awry is context, the environments, experiences, and relationships in our lives. Now, this was completely different than anything that I had expected. I thought, you mean context drives our biology and our genetics? I thought genes were the drivers, but no. Genes are little packages of proteins. They're covered with receptors that are triggered to expression by the environments and experiences we expose them to. So genes are not the drivers of who we become. Context drives the expression of our genes. And when I speak of context, I'm talking about communities, health, nutrition, families, schools, and teachers. So right at the beginning, there were these two huge things that I never expected, but they help to explain the variations that we see in health, in illness, in learning, in performance. So when I tell you that each of us have 20,000 genes in our genome, that's what each of us has. But in our lifetime, fewer than 10% of these will ever get expressed. So what do you think determines what gets in that 10%? It's context. And this is what defines all of human life. So context is this all-important thing, but I have to explain to you how context gets under the skin and into the body and the brain. Because the brain is up there, encased in the skull, and it's actually separated from the body by something called the blood-brain barrier. So how does context get inside? To understand that, we need to understand that we're mammals. And as mammals, the majority of the growth of our brains happens after we're born. Now, this is crucial to understand. The majority of the growth of the human brain happens after birth. So think about babies. When they come out, they're actually pretty helpless. But you can look at them, and they appear to change just a little bit every day. What's actually going on there? If you were a horse, you would be born walking and running and doing all the things that horses do, but not human babies. The brain of human babies is astoundingly malleable, and their growth is something that we call experience dependent. The human brain, the brain of a baby, is triggered to grow by the environments and relationships that we expose it to. The other thing we know about the human brain is that it grows for a long time, well into adulthood. There are critical periods, and I'm sure many of you know that 0 to 5, early childhood, is one of those critical periods. But there are new critical periods being discovered today, and one of them that is so important for us as educators is adolescence. The adolescent brain is capable of things that are not possible at any other time. So all of this is to say that the brain is a dynamic living structure that is made up of tissue that is the most susceptible to change from experience of any tissue in the human body. So there are only 3 things that you have to remember about brain development: astounding malleability, experience-dependent growth, and the role of context. And all of this taken together means that there is no such thing as a developing child independent of context. But I still haven't explained to you exactly how context gets inside. And to do that, I have to tell you about the limbic system, because the limbic system is the learning center of the brain. It consists of 3 structures: the prefrontal cortex for focus and attention, the hippocampus for memory, and the amygdala, which is the emotional center of the brain. These 3 structures develop together, they're cross-wired, and they're interdependent. One of the things that is crucial to understand about the limbic system is that it too is covered with receptors for 2 hormonal systems, one that responds to stress and the other that responds to trust and love. And this is not an accident. Cortisol is our primary stress hormone, and oxytocin is our primary trust love hormone. These hormones, think of them as chemical messengers that are triggered by experiences in our lives, and they carry messages into the brain to the very same structure, the limbic system. So when we talk about how context gets inside, this is one of the mechanisms that enables context to get under the skin and into the brain. So let's start with cortisol and our stress response system. Stress is the most common naturally occurring example of negative context. When we experience stress, cortisol floods our body and our brains, and it produces that very familiar feeling of fight, flight, and freeze. How many of you have had that feeling? Up. Okay, that's because it is the normal stress response. So if you have ever prepared for a test or a performance, you know what cortisol feels like. It's intense when it happens, but it's adaptive because we know that what that does is it makes us alert. It makes us focused. It helps us prepare. This is your limbic system at work. Attention, concentration, focus, memory in service to performance. But children who have high levels of stress, stress that has not been buffered by the presence of a trusted adult, children can get locked in that fight or flight feeling. So if I ask you how many of you know what an ACE is? ACEs, right. Adverse childhood experiences, experiences of overwhelming stress that are caused by things like exposure to violence, severe neglect, sexual abuse, and racism. Right now I'm thinking about Ta-Nehisi Coates, who was your speaker last year. And I'm remembering a paragraph in that book where he talks about walking to school and counting his steps and having to have certain gestures that would enable him to be protected as he walked to school. When children have greater than 4 of these experiences, they are susceptible to something called toxic stress, where this system gets locked in the on position. When you have children like this in a classroom, they struggle to focus, and they can get very, very easily triggered. So cortisol can do a lot of damage to the structures of the limbic system, because what we know is that adversity doesn't just happen to children. It happens inside their brains and bodies through the biologic mechanism of stress. But that's not the end of the story. There's a very big upside when we talk about the hormone oxytocin, because this system, the oxytocin system, is the one that produces feelings of love, attachment, safety. And this hormone hits the very same structures in the brain as cortisol, the structures of the limbic system. But here is something else. Oxytocin is the more powerful hormone at the level of the cell. Relationships that are strong, consistent, positive, and caring, strong enough to trigger the release of oxytocin, not only help children manage stress, prevent the damage from cortisol, but they enable children to become resilient to future stress. So when we speak about the human relationship, we're not just talking about being nice to a child. We're speaking of a connection that is full of trust, full of caring and protection. The kind that can make a child believe something about themselves that they couldn't believe until you entered their life. Just like what my doctor did for me. Lisa Delpit calls these adults warm demanders. Warm demanders. People who ask a lot of kids, but people who give a lot. People who build belief in children. The human relationship is the most positive example we have of positive context. So, how many of you have heard about the marshmallow test? Ooh, a lot of you. Okay. The marshmallow test was a test that was conducted in a Stanford nursery school in the 1970s. And if you remember this, children were put in a room with a marshmallow, and they were told that if you can delay eating that marshmallow for 15 minutes, you're going to get a second marshmallow. And the kids that could delay and exert that kind of self-control, those kids and those findings were correlated with all kinds of positive things: high SAT scores, college acceptance, later success in life. So let's watch how it went. So now let's fast forward to 2012. A researcher, Dr. Celeste Kidd, who was then at the University of Rochester, but who had worked in a homeless shelter, asked herself, would any of my kids from the homeless shelter have ever waited to get that second marshmallow? So this researcher decided to do the test, but under a different set of conditions. So she brought children into a room, and there were a lot of broken crayons on the desk. And she said to the kids, I'm going to come back and give you a brand new set of crayons. And with half the kids, that's exactly what she did. But with the other half, she came back and she said, sorry, I couldn't do it. Then she repeated the marshmallow test. And what do you think happened? Okay, the kids where the promise was kept, no problem. They waited, they got their second marshmallow. But for the kids where the promise was broken, they gobbled up that first marshmallow right away. So this ability to delay gratification, to exert self-control, turns out it has a lot to do with whether you trust the person giving you the marshmallow. But here's the thing that I want you to see in what Dr. Kidd did. She challenged the assumptions in the original test. She made the leap to understanding that self-control, this malleable skill, this skill that is so important to learning, is not just in the child. It's in the child in an environment designed to reveal the skill. In this case, it was through the experience of a trustful relationship. This researcher altered the microenvironment around these children, and by doing so, she was able to reveal this skill, this critical skill for learning, that these children actually had. Skills and talents exist in a potential state in all children. If there is one thing that you take away from the talk today, it is that skills and talents exist in a potential state in all children. So think about what this story means about the environments that we could design to reveal the talents and skills that children actually have. But then also think about the talents and skills in children that we as adults don't see and won't see unless we design the environments to reveal them. So now I have to take you back to 2001, because in 2001, I was a practicing child psychiatrist specializing in trauma. And if you asked me back then, did I understand the role of context in children's development? I absolutely thought I did. But this was the year of the Trade Center attacks, and like every parent, teacher, and therapist in New York, I was wondering, what would an event of this magnitude mean to New York City's children? So fortunately, the Department of Education and the Mailman School of Public Health were asking that question. And they asked me to help lead a study to answer it. And of course, going into it, we assumed that the greatest effects were going to be in those schools and with kids in the ground zero area, but that's not what the data showed. The data said that the greatest effects were in the schools and the children in the communities of deepest poverty. So I went to visit those schools. And I remember walking into an elementary school in the South Bronx, into a first grade classroom. And a teacher was asking the kids to draw a drawing of what 9/11 meant to help them digest the experience. And this little boy, who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, named Thomas, walked up to me and showed me his drawing. And in his drawing, there were these two little boxes with smoke coming out in the background. In the foreground were two stick figure boys with guns pointed at each other. Okay, the pattern in our data was the same as the story in Thomas's drawing. Fears about safety are local, and it is those fears that were activating the biologic mechanisms, the stress mechanisms that we've been talking about. So this became a personal turning point for me, because this was the point at which I left my practice and founded Turnaround for Children. I saw many children whose learning was being interfered with by the effects of stress on the learning systems of the brain. And I saw schools that were doing everything in their power to improve academics, but seemingly without an awareness of race, of bias, of stress, and the effects of stress on the learning systems of the brain. And I saw that if you narrowly target academics and you don't think about how children become learners in the first place, the forces that accelerate or are barriers to that process, children aren't going to be able to do what we're asking of them. And then you up the academic pressure, and they fall farther and farther behind. But this is not a reason to lower expectations. This is not a reason to lower challenge. As Lisa Delpit said, the fact is challenge and high expectations are accelerants to academic growth. But it is these issues that caused me to leave my practice and found Turnaround, because we believed as an organization that we could design tools and practices and services that could turn any school into a positive developmental and academic force in a child's life. And to this day, that is what Turnaround is dedicated to. We have one foot in the world of learning science, and we have another in the application of that science in real schools. But the school I visited and the little boy who showed me that drawing are not an exception. They're part of a large and growing number of schools across every demographic in the United States, because since 2013, greater than 51% of kids are growing up in low-income households. And stress, like the stress that comes from income insecurity and from race, that kind of stress is not something you either have or you don't. It exists in different intensities, But what is alarming is the number of children who will walk into school struggling to focus and pay attention to learning. Think about the challenge that that represents, because we're not talking about a few schools, a few teachers, or a few children. This has been Turnaround's work. We have worked in over 100 schools. Many of our partners are right here. And in each of the schools we've worked with, the pattern at the beginning was the same. Lots of kids seeming to be unready for learning, a negative culture, significant academic underperformance, and teachers who shared with us that nothing in their training fully prepared them for this set of challenges. But now, as you listen to me, you can trace this unreadiness to the effects of stress on the learning systems of the brain. So for sure today, don't we have to stop asking children to beat the odds? And armed with what we know from the science of learning and development, use that knowledge to change the odds for many, many more children. So in 2017, we became one of the members of the Science of Learning and Development Initiative with 6 other partners, and incredible visionary leadership and support from Jim Shelton and his team at Chan Zuckerberg. Today, this is an expanding coalition of organizations that are seeking system transformation, grounded in what we know today about the science of learning and development. But our first task when this began was actually to answer the question, what science? What science should we pay attention to if our aim is to design a system using what we know today about the developing brain and learning science? So we produced a 3-volume synthesis, 2 on science, 1 on practice, and they were published in the Journal of Applied Developmental Science, and all 3 of them can be downloaded on Turnaround's website. But I need to give you a short answer to what is in those papers, because the science is really clear in terms of what it points to. It is calling for the comprehensive development of each and every learner through whole child personalization of learning. It's asking for a design for our schools that is mapped to the way the brain learns, a design that combines certain things: strong relationships, a culture of safety and belonging, rich, rigorous, mastery-oriented instructional experiences, integrated supports, and the intentional development of the skills and mindsets and habits that all successful learners have. We have the science today, and the momentum around using it is growing. But I think I know what you're thinking right now, because what's most needed in the field are easier ways of putting these pieces together. Integrated platforms, integrated practices that enable every leader, teacher, and coach to actually know how to make this a reality for every child that they're working with. So this is where we're going to go next. How many of you have seen this framework before? Okay, so this is an in crowd. Okay, you don't get so many raised hands in many other places, but I always ask. This is the building blocks for learning, and it was developed by Brooke Stafford Brizard and a team of us at Turnaround in 2016. And again, we started with a question. How does any child become an engaged, productive learner? What skills do they have to have? Because if there were pathways, like there are for reading and math, in principle, we could design classrooms and practices to intentionally develop these skills in any child. In other words, we could develop the learner no matter what their starting point. So when you look at these skills, every skill in the framework is malleable, That means it can be built. They're highly correlated with achievement. And what's really, really important here is that we actually didn't set out to build a framework. Okay, the framework fell out of the literature we reviewed. And you can see this framework is organized as a developmental progression. Think about complex skills in your own life. Don't they develop in stages? Well, these kinds of skills develop that way too. But I also don't want you to worry that you would have to go and develop 16 separate skills, because these skills actually often spiral in development. You develop one and other things are triggered. But if you take a look at the bottom two rows, you're looking at foundational skills. Foundational skills are things like self-regulation, executive function, social skills. And right above that are mindsets for school, like growth mindset and sense of belonging. And then right at the top are those higher order skills that we would want every single student to have. Things like agency, self-direction, curiosity. But I want you to take a closer look again at the bottom two rows, because these are skills that are supposed to be in place as a child enters kindergarten so that they're ready for school. But now we know that vulnerable children often have uneven development of these skills. And that often makes them unready for learning. But in principle, if our classrooms had these practices in place, it wouldn't matter, because the classroom would be positioned to catch kids up no matter what their starting point. So the big aha for us when we were doing this piece of work was realizing that the 20th century education system was never designed to develop the learner. It was never designed to develop these skills. Ooh, okay. We recognize the truth of that. Okay, all right. But what the 20th century system was designed to do is to deliver content to kids and then test them and use testing to determine whether they get to go on to a good job or a good college or good outcomes in their lives. But think about that, okay? An education system that wasn't designed to develop the learner. That means it wasn't designed for equity, okay? And it wasn't designed to unleash the fullest potential in each and every child. So the headline here is that if we don't intentionally develop these skills, children could be unready for learning as early as kindergarten. They could fall behind. They could be at risk not to develop these critical higher order, deeper learning skills that we know they're going to need for learning, work, and life. Okay, so this means that one of our non-negotiables for the new 21st century system that we will build together is the intentional development of skills, mindsets, and habits that all successful learners have. But we have a second non-negotiable. And the second non-negotiable we've talked about, it is the human relationship, the most powerful example we have of positive context. The human relationship is the engine for belief, for courage, for identity. It is also the strongest buffer we have against the effects of stress. And it's the energy source for the brain. Because believe it or not, the brain is an electrical circuit. That's right. Important connections to key people in our life, people like families and teachers, stimulate the circuitry of the brain, inoculate the brain against stress, and actually enable children to develop these complex skills, skills like riding a bike, reading a book, even skills like tenacity and resilience, because we are stimulating the connections between critical brain structures. The brain grows its entire ability to do complex things when more and more connections form between the different structures of the brain. And what drives those connections, what creates the energy for those connections, are integrated experiences with people in our lives. Okay, a great example of this is how we learn how to read. Okay, first we're read to. We start to recognize individual letters. Then we recognize how letters form words, and words conjure up images and feelings. And plus, we love being read to. So this is how the brain learns to read, because each part of learning how to read involves different brain structures that get wired together into a neural pathway, and eventually we acquire this complex skill called reading. Okay, if you don't believe me, take a look at this PET scan. This is the PET scan of a brain reading. Okay, and look at the areas that are lighted up: sight, hearing, expression, and comprehension. But they're all in different locations in the brain. This is the wiring of a neural pathway in order for a child to become a reader. So if relationships are the fuel for this kind of development, let's see how we would put them at the center of learning. So I want to share 2 video clips with you that are from a series called How Learning Happens. It was produced by George Lucas's studio, Edutopia, with us and Linda Darling Hammond. And just to give you an idea of the demand now for these kinds of integrated practices, we launched this series on January 15th. By today, it has already had 7.5 million views. And by far the most popular of the videos is the one I'm going to show you on the power of relationships. Let's take a look.
You had so much to offer yesterday. You okay?
I'm tired.
So what's going on?
Strong relationships are central to the learning process. What the science of learning and development tells us is that we need to create learning environments which allow for strong, long-term relationships for children to become attached to school and to the adults and other children in it.
When children have experiences of closeness and consistency and trust, oxytocin is released. Oxytocin has many, many positive effects on the development of the brain. So when we think about a relationship, we're not just talking about being nice to a child. We're talking about a child having an experience of attunement and trust strong enough to release the hormone oxytocin.
Good morning, Ariella. How you doing today?
The purpose of the morning greeting is to connect with them and to just make sure that I'm seeing them as humans. Like, I'm making that relationship with them, making that bond.
I prioritize relationship building because getting to know them is the best part of the job.
When I come in the morning, we usually talk about things that are happening in our community.
We're trying to build caring and respect.
The teacher is trying to understand who I am and my values as a person.
When I have a free 45 minutes or an hour, I think to myself, I could sit down and catch up on Grady, or I could go and make connections, whether it's a smile or a joke or a reminder. It validates their presence in the building.
Rock it out in the art room. It starts from so much honesty and transparency with kids. It's really easy to strive to be this like idealized, always ready to go elementary school teacher, and that's not real and that's not human. When people start talking about other things while I'm still giving directions, it feels frustrating for me and I have to take a breath. My students connect most with me when they see that I also struggle and I also have challenges. It takes a lot of vulnerability on my part.
Total familiarity. When that student knows that you care about them, when they know that you're a human, let's think about that. Their academic performance in your class is going to be better.
If I'm comfortable around them, then I'm more confident around them, and it's easier to ask questions and things like that.
So when you're looking at this graph, What is it that you think happened?
Some teachers I don't always get along with the best, so then sometimes I'm like, I can't do it, so I'm just not gonna do it. But when I like the teacher, I want to do their work. I'll be like, I can learn this.
You all have done outstanding work.
Emotion and learning are completely connected. If you're in a positive emotional space, if you feel good about yourself, your teacher, that actually opens up the opportunity for more learning.
Good to see.
One of the things I hope you all do is go to the Edutopia website. There are 22 more videos. The videos are short and they capture this kind of integrated practice. And one of the things you come away with is this is doable. But here are 3 specific practices that would put relationships at the center of learning. I suspect that many of you know them. The first is the 2x10. Imagine you have a disruptive child in your class, and you go up to that child and you say, how about we have a conversation with each other for 2 minutes a day? And the teacher does that, never using it as an incentive and never withholding it as a punishment. But for 10 days straight, they have these moments with each other. Believe it or not, this is one of the best studied practices that is so effective, not just for the behavior of the child, but for increasing that student-teacher connection, the belief. Then you have advisories. Advisories are these groups of small groups of kids with a teacher who get together weekly, and they can talk about academics, but they can also talk about things going on in students' lives. This is another practice that very strongly connects students and teachers, but also students with each other, and has dramatic effects on the learning culture of a classroom. And then there's looping. One of the things I was so struck by in moving from medicine to education was this idea that we think that it's okay to have a 1-year relationship with somebody that you trust. Remember, I'm coming from psychiatry where you have a long-term relationship with somebody that you trust. So looping is a practice where a child and a teacher can have a 2- or 3-year relationship to one another. All 3 of these practices would put relationships at the center of learning and the culture of the school. So relationships, intentional skill building, these are 2 of our non-negotiables in this new system. Again, I think I know what you might be thinking, which is, how am I going to put these pieces together? But here's the thing. Every one of the practices that I've been talking about can be integrated with content. So before I show you the next clip, I have to ask you one more question. Has anybody here ever procrastinated? Yeah, okay. So I can tell that you want to be real with me, okay? Right. It's really, really, really common, okay? But executive functions are a set of skills that are not just crucial for learning, they're actually crucial for avoiding procrastination through something called prioritization. So the video clip I'm about to show you is from a middle school in Portland, Maine. And as you watch it, I want you to pay particular attention to how many things are going on in this classroom simultaneously. Okay, remember what we've been talking about is integrated practice. Take a look at how many things are going on at the same time, and particularly focus on the teacher-student relationship.
Okay, so which one of those things is probably going to be your frog?
Mark Twain said, if you wake up every morning and eat a frog, everything else will taste great. So I taught them to take their frog from the list, which is the thing they want to do the least, and get it out of the way. because everything else will seem easy.
A frog is like the most important assignment, like it's the one I'm really worried about.
Dry ice. So, okay, you gotta do that. What's your frog?
It helps me like realize I need to get this done faster than I need to get this done. So even though this is more fun, I need to get this out of the way before I can do this.
So as soon as we're done with that priority list, I notice everyone gets right to work because they have it spelled out very clearly for them.
So what you saw in this clip is a teacher and a student partnering together to teach an entire class executive function skills by teaching prioritization. That's the frog. You know, this is such a sticky practice that I promise you, even at turnaround, if we see like one of our colleagues avoiding something, we go up to them and say, "What's your frog?" Okay, it's very, very sticky. But students in this class discovered that by doing what's hard first, they created energy, motivation, confidence, and had the brain space to even do more work. Bringing this kind of skill development to life in a classroom means classrooms designed for relationships and teamwork. It means adults trained to know about the developing brain and how the brain learns. And it means access to integrated tools and practices, not just for content mastery, but to develop the skills and mindsets and habits of successful learners all at the same time. Practitioners today are craving these kinds of tools. So I want to ask you a question based on all the things that we've been talking about. Are you a person who believes that skills are something that some kids have and others don't? That some kids are really capable while others are not? Because if you believe this, then you are with the scientist in the 1890s, Sir Francis Galton, who actually believed that human skill fell into bins of abilities depending on how near or far you are from the average. If you believe this, you need to read Todd Rose's book, The End of Average. Or are you with the education psychologist Benjamin Bloom, who in 1985 in his 2 Sigma paper said, "What one child can do, all children can do under highly favorable conditions." Because if you believe this, then it means challenging our assumptions about what children are capable of, and quite possibly challenging the assumptions that sit underneath our education system. Because remember what I said to you, talent and skills exist in a potential state in all children. Talent is not a bell curve. And if we continue to standardize the approach to building talent and skill, for sure it's going to work for some kids and not for others. But more importantly, it absolutely will not reveal the talent and skills that many children have. Very often at this point in this talk, I get asked this question, do you think that there is a Mozart in every child and we just have to uncover it? And that's really not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that if there were a Martin Luther King, a Mozart, or a Malala in a classroom the way many of our classrooms today are designed, it's likely we wouldn't know that they were there. We've reached the limit of what can be achieved using standardized approaches, just as many, many other fields have. Years ago, cancer researchers were stuck in therapies that work for some patients and not for others, and they asked why. And then they realized that they had to understand something about the environment around the cancer cell. They needed to understand the microenvironment of that cell in order to create more personalized therapies, more context-sensitive therapies. And when cancer researchers got to this insight, that moment was a huge inflection in cancer research that produced many, many cures for many more patients. Reform in education has been linear. Accountability, test scores. These approaches have offered progress in knowing where kids are academically. It's important, but it's not an entire answer because these approaches are also standardized, which means that they can hide skills and talents that many, many children possess. Breakthroughs are not going to come when we believe we can achieve them, doing things that we've always done, just doing them a little bit better. The approaches we've taken so far to learning in schools have not challenged our assumptions about talent. Is it plentiful or is it scarce? Or about human growth? Are skills malleable or are they fixed? Or about human potential? What is any child capable of under the right conditions? Okay, if we made a shift like the shift that I'm talking about right now, this would be an exponential change in our learning systems and in our outcomes for many more children. Because this is a belief grounded in an understanding that we can design environments to reveal who children are. This is a shift that means that the biologic mechanisms that lead to the fullest expression of a child's potential are the very same mechanisms that will get us to equity, highly favorable conditions. Building them into all the environments in which children grow and learn will put many children on the path to equity and all children on the path to the fullest expression of their potential. It's actually one developmental path. What we understand is that children get on at different points, but it's one developmental path, biologically speaking. But the shift I'm talking about is a fundamental change grounded in what we know today about human development, learning science, and the development of the brain. And it starts with this mind-blowing insight that context grows the brain, triggers the expression of our genes, harnesses the brain's astonishing malleability to reveal the potential in our children. We can ask and answer the same questions that the cancer researchers asked, that Dr. Celeste Kidd asked about the marshmallow test. And that question is, what will work for this child in this context? And it is that question that gets you fundamentally different answers about the way our learning systems need to be designed. This is what my doctor did for me, and it changed the entire trajectory of my life. The message in the science is so optimistic. Genes are chemical followers. This is the biologic truth that context shapes the expression of our genes. That schools designed, as Bloom said, such that what one child can do, all children can do under highly favorable conditions. This is our school and system of the future. This is what Turnaround's work is dedicated to see and unleash the potential, the talent, the gifts in each and every child so that they can learn and thrive in their lives. There are many reasons that I feel so grateful to be here today working with you. I have felt grateful each of the 9 years of Turnaround's partnership with all of you. So I'm really, really thankful for the opportunity to talk to you today. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Please join me in giving Dr. Cantor another round of applause, please.
Thank you.
We have a gift for you.
Thank you.
We've been sharing this gift with all of our presenters. It's a book, and it's a great book about the history of education here in DC. So again, thank you for your leadership.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ferebee. Thank you for having me today. Thank you.
Pam and Axton and I, we're going to share the stage for a minute to close us out. What you've heard today hopefully has resonated well, because I am looking at the people who have the greatest influence on the classrooms and the condition in the District of Columbia Public Schools. Am I not? Oh, that was quiet. I thought we were awake this morning. I am looking at the leaders who have the greatest influence on the conditions of the classrooms in the schools in the District of Columbia Public Schools. And I see you. I know who you are. Seriously, I can share from my own experience as a turnaround principal, with the responsibility of transforming a school with over 90% of the students of color, 90% of the students qualifying for a free and reduced lunch. We did not turn the corner until we stopped trying to fix the fish. And what I'm explaining to you is you have to focus on the conditions of your buildings in your school. Because oftentimes we spend a lot of time trying to fix children, and each day we're sending them into contaminated lakes and streams and rivers in which they can't succeed. Yesterday we talked about the challenging of the sweltering smog that we all breathe and take in and take out. Today what I want you to hear is that you have great influence on the conditions of your buildings to ensure that students get what they need. So if you believe that there's no bell curve, you believe that all of our students come to our buildings each day talented and prepared, ready for success, you will ensure that they have the conditions to succeed. And again, I share that from personal experience. The moment that we focused on creating the conditions in which all of our students can be successful, you heard it today, great brain science, human development. If you start your day in ensuring that your schools have that lens day in and day out, you then send students into an environment where they can succeed. And so my challenge to you is to not focus on fixing the fish, but ensure that the fish have the appropriate lakes and streams to survive and succeed. I remind you what I shared with you yesterday. To do this work, you cannot achieve this by chance or circumstance. If you want the best learning environments for our students, you have to be strategic and intentional about everything that you do. It is very easy for the adults to want to fix the scholars and the young people in the building. But a part of the conditions in the school that need to be improved are often driven by the adults in the building who have to take a hard look in the mirror each day. So I'll get off my soapbox, but I didn't want to leave Pam's wonderful presentation without sharing my personal experience with you and challenging you to ensure that we have the right conditions for our students to succeed. I challenge you for this level of excellence and to be strategic and intentional about the environments that you create and you influence in your schools. I thank you.
And thank you.